there weren't a lot of lawsuits that were ever brought against White Star Lines or the Board of Trade following the Titanic disaster.
Okay, so I do know the answer to this. I know why. And for context, I'm not in law school. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just an insurance nerd and a Titanic nerd. And I happened to listen to this podcast like a few months ago that I actually made a video on about this podcast because I thought it was so interesting about insurance liability in regards to the Titanic. And the reason why there weren't so many lawsuits related to the sinking of the Titanic was actually because of this law, the Limitation of Liability Act of 1851. And it's actually like a thing that's still used today. Like, do you remember, I think it was in June, the boat that hit the bridge in Maryland? They used that law to restrict their liability. So basically, what this law says is a vessel limits the damage claims to the value of the vessel at the end of the voyage, plus any pending freight, as long as the owner can prove it lacked knowledge of the problem beforehand. So this is from Lewis and Clark Law Review about the Titanic and the liability and all that stuff. So this will be super interesting if you're in law school or if you're a lawyer or if you're just a nerd like me. But if you look, the board concluded that the Titanic was being driven too fast through an area known to contain dangerous ice conditions, but did not hold its captain to be negligent, in part because it was a common practice on the North Atlantic. And then it goes on to say, eventually the parties reached a formal settlement on July 28, 1916 for the amount of $664,000. The claimants agreed to end their claims in the U.S. and England, and they acknowledged that the White Star Line had no privity or knowledge of any negligence on the Titanic, going back to that limited liability law. And the freaking kicker is that number, that 664,000, was essentially what they deemed the value of the ship to be when it sank. So they were including the value of the lifeboats that essentially saved people from death. But I do recommend that podcast. It's called Insurance vs. History. Super, super informative, not just about the Titanic. She goes into a number of different historical events and how insurance relates to it. So highly recommend, and hopefully this was helpful.